A world apart. Cora Johnson's fingers trembled slightly as she fastened the last button on her crisp red and white uniform. At 62 years old, she had long since learned to push through the aches and pains that came with age, her hands roughened by decades of hard work. Her reflection in the mirror above her modest dresser revealed a woman who had weathered life's storms with quiet dignity. The lines on her face told stories of struggle and perseverance, but her eyes still held a glimmer of hope, even after all these years. Her small apartment was modest, neatly kept, and cluttered with memories of a life spent in service. A faded photograph on the wall caught her attention. A younger version of herself, smiling proudly outside the diner where she had worked for over 20 years. That job, like many others, had come and gone, leaving Cora to start over once again. Retirement wasn't an option. She couldn't afford it. The thought brought a sigh to her lips as she gathered her things and stepped out into the pre-dawn chill of the morning. The streets were quiet, almost serene, as she made her way to the bus stop. It was a journey Cora had become accustomed to, a daily reminder of the divide between her world and the world she now served. As the bus passed through increasingly affluent neighborhoods, the gap between her life and those of the people she worked for seemed more profound. By the time she arrived at the Regency Grand Hotel, with its gleaming facade and towering presence, Cora felt like an intruder in a realm of unimaginable wealth and privilege. The hotel was a different world entirely, a world where luxury dripped from every corner, and wealth whispered in every conversation. Cora, however, remained invisible in this world. She slipped through the employee entrance, exchanging quiet nods with fellow workers, each of them beginning their shifts with the same resigned efficiency. Her colleagues, mostly younger maids, moved with purpose, their carts laden with fresh linens and cleaning supplies. Cora observed them quietly, always keeping her head down, always making herself small in the presence of such grandeur. Today, however, felt different. There was a buzz in the air, an energy that set her on edge. Whispers circulated among the staff, snippets of conversation that seemed to carry an undercurrent of excitement. "Did you hear? The big-shot millionaire is checking in today," one maid whispered as Cora passed by. "Great," another replied, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Another rich guy who thinks he's better than everyone else." Cora kept her thoughts to herself, focusing on her duties. Years of experience had taught her that it was safer to remain unseen and unheard in places like this. Guests like the one staying at the Regency Grand rarely noticed people like her, and that was how she preferred it. The less attention she drew, the smoother her day would go. Her first task of the morning was to prepare the rooms for new guests. Each room was a canvas of opulence, with plush carpets, silk curtains, and marble bathrooms. Cora moved through them with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting her craft. The beds were made with hospital corners so sharp they could cut paper, and every surface gleamed under her careful touch. She erased all evidence of the previous guests, creating a pristine space for the next set of visitors who would undoubtedly treat it with casual indifference. As she worked, Cora's thoughts drifted to the life she had once imagined for herself. In her younger days, she had dreams of a family, a home, and a sense of accomplishment. But life had other plans, and over time, those dreams had faded into the background. Now, her only goal was to make it through another day, another week, another year. The routine tasks of the morning helped keep her mind occupied, but a growing sense of unease gnawed at her. Something was different today. The whispers among the staff, the subtle shift in the hotel's atmosphere. It all felt charged, as if something significant was about to happen. Cora tried to push the feeling aside as she made her way to the top floor of the hotel, a place reserved for the most exclusive guests. The air on the top floor was different, thicker, more laden with the scent of wealth and privilege. The carpet was plusher, the wallpaper more ornate, and the very atmosphere seemed to hum with exclusivity. Cora paused for a moment, leaning on her cart, allowing herself a brief respite. In that moment of quiet, she felt the weight of her years pressing down on her. It was then that she allowed herself a rare indulgence. For just a moment, she imagined what it would be like to be one of the guests she served, to walk these halls with confidence, to be seen, to matter. The thought was fleeting, quickly dismissed as reality reasserted itself. She straightened her uniform, pushed her cart forward, and steeled herself for the rest of the day. But as Cora turned the corner to continue her duties, something caught her attention. The elevator at the end of the corridor dinged, and out stepped a man who immediately commanded the space around him. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Cora earned in a year. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly coiffed, and he moved with an air of arrogance that seemed to create a bubble of superiority around him. This, Cora realized, must be the millionaire VIP the staff had been talking about. He was flanked by two young assistants, both furiously tapping on tablets, and behind them trailed a procession of bellhops struggling under the weight of numerous expensive-looking suitcases. The man barely acknowledged their efforts as he strode down the hallway with the confidence of someone who expected the world to bow before him. Cora instinctively stepped back, pressing herself against the wall, trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible. But as the group passed, the millionaire's sharp gaze landed on her, his eyes narrowing, as if he had spotted something unpleasant. "You there," he barked, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. Cora flinched, realizing he was addressing her. "Make sure my suite is spotless. I won't tolerate any oversights." The way he said oversights made it clear that perfection was not just expected, it was demanded. Before Cora could respond, the entourage moved on, disappearing around the corner toward the most luxurious suite in the hotel. Cora stood there for a moment, her heart racing, feeling as if she had been struck by a cold wind. She had dealt with difficult guests before, but something about this man unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite explain. As she stood there, trying to steady her nerves, her manager, Mr. Thompson, hurried down the hallway, his face flushed with urgency. "Cora," he said, his voice tight. "The VIP in Suite 1205. Mr. Blackwood. He's a very important guest. Make sure everything is perfect. No mistakes. Understand?" Cora nodded, her throat tight. She had faced many challenges in her life, but something told her that this particular guest would test her in ways she had never been tested before. Little did she know, the events that were about to unfold would change everything. Her job, her life, and even her perception of the world she had come to accept. The meeting in the suite. Cora could feel her pulse quicken as she entered the VIP suite, her heart racing against the polished silence of the luxurious surroundings. The suite was unlike anything she had seen before, an expansive and meticulously designed space that oozed wealth from every corner. She glanced briefly at the grand living room area, a high ceiling supported by ornate columns, a chandelier made of crystal that shimmered in the soft light, and art on the walls that looked as though it belonged in a museum rather than a hotel room. It was a world apart from the modest life she had lived. As Cora rolled her cart across the plush carpet, she could hear faint voices from the master bedroom. She instinctively moved toward it, quietly adjusting her posture, bracing herself for another potential confrontation with the arrogant millionaire. As she approached the doorway, Reginald Blackwood's voice pierced the air. "This is unacceptable," he bellowed, speaking into his phone. "I don't care if you have to fly a designer out from Milan. I won't step foot into that gala unless I'm wearing something that fits my status." Cora froze just outside the door. She had dealt with wealthy people before, but Reginald was on a different level. He carried himself with an air of superiority that was impossible to ignore. She had witnessed this same attitude in other guests before, people who believed their money gave them the right to treat others as mere accessories in their lives. "Come in," his sharp voice suddenly commanded, as if sensing her presence before she had even knocked. Cora cautiously stepped into the room. The opulence here was even more overwhelming. The bed was a king-sized monstrosity draped in the finest silks, while the large windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, far removed from the gritty streets where Cora had spent her life. Reginald Blackwood was seated on a luxurious chaise longue, his eyes still glued to his phone. He didn't even glance up as she entered. His assistants, as impeccably dressed as before, hovered near him like satellites, typing on their devices. Cora cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, sir. I'm here too." "Did I ask for you to speak?" Reginald interrupted sharply, finally looking up from his phone. His eyes were cold and piercing, the kind that made you feel smaller, insignificant. Cora swallowed hard. She had endured worse in her life. Years of customers in diners barking orders at her. Years of being overlooked by people who would never bother to learn her name. But something about Reginald's tone was cutting in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just dismissive. It was dehumanizing. "Make sure the room is spotless," he said dismissively, waving a hand in her direction, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture. "I have important business to attend to and don't have time for incompetence." The sting of his words hit her harder than she wanted to admit, but Cora said nothing. Instead, she nodded curtly, her pride buried beneath the need to keep her job. As she moved about the suite, quietly cleaning the already immaculate space, she could feel Reginald's eyes on her from time to time, assessing her with the same disdain he might have for a smudge on his perfectly polished shoes. He was engrossed in his phone again, typing furiously. She couldn't help but overhear parts of his conversation, especially when his tone grew angrier. "Do I look like someone who cares about excuses?" He snapped at whoever was on the other end of the call. "I want results, not apologies. And I don't care if your factory is running behind. You'll get it done, or you'll find yourself out of business." Cora shook her head quietly as she worked. She had seen men like this before, men who believed the world existed solely for their benefit, the kind of man who treated others as disposable tools, necessary but undeserving of respect. As she dusted a nearby surface, Cora's mind wandered to her late husband, Franklin. He had been a kind man, quiet but strong in his own way. He had worked hard his entire life, first as a mechanic, then later as a truck driver when times got tough. Franklin had been her rock, the person who had kept her grounded through years of hardship. They had never had much, but they had loved each other deeply. Losing him 5 years ago had left a hole in her heart that no amount of work or routine could fill. "You're still here." Reginald's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. She looked up to find him standing in front of her, his expression one of growing irritation. "I'm just finishing up, sir," Cora replied, keeping her tone as neutral as possible. "Good," he muttered, turning his back to her as he walked toward the large window overlooking the city. "I need peace and quiet, and I need this room to stay clean. I'll have important people here later, and I don't want anything out of place." Cora nodded again, though the way he spoke of important people rubbed her the wrong way. She knew he didn't consider her, or anyone like her, to be among them. To him, she was just another faceless employee who existed only to make his life more comfortable. As she made her way back to the cart, Cora felt the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. Not just the exhaustion of physical labor, but the kind that came from being treated as if you were invisible, or worse, a burden. "Wait," Reginald's voice called out again, stopping her in her tracks. Cora turned, surprise. Reginald was now looking at her more intently, a curious glint in his eye that hadn't been there before. His tone was no longer as sharp, but it still carried that edge of superiority. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked, his eyes scanning her with faint interest, as if he were examining a piece of furniture. "Doing what, sir?" Cora replied cautiously. "This," he gestured vaguely around the room. "Cleaning, working these kinds of jobs." Cora hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. She didn't know what he was getting at, but something about his tone made her uneasy. "A long time," she said finally, keeping her response short. Reginald gave a small, humorless chuckle. "I thought so. You look like someone who's seen a lot." Cora didn't respond. What was there to say? Of course she had seen a lot. She had seen the inside of more hotels, diners, and people's homes than she cared to remember. She had lived through hardships that men like Reginald couldn't even imagine. "Well," Reginald said, his tone shifting slightly, "just make sure you don't miss anything. I expect perfection, and I won't tolerate anything less." There it was again, that biting condescension wrapped in a veneer of politeness. Cora nodded once more, but inside, she was seething. She had dealt with men like this her whole life, men who believed their money gave them the right to treat others as beneath them. And though she had learned to keep her head down, something about Reginald's attitude had struck a nerve today. As she pushed her cart out of the suite and into the hallway, Cora couldn't help but feel a deep sense of frustration welling up inside her. She had spent her entire life working for men like Reginald Blackwood, enduring their arrogance, their entitlement, their belief that they were better than everyone else. But something about today felt different. Something inside her had begun to stir, a quiet but growing realization that perhaps she had allowed herself to be invisible for too long. And as she moved through the hallway, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her, Cora couldn't shake the feeling that the events of this day were far from over. A shift in the balance. The hallway outside Reginald Blackwood's suite seemed to stretch on forever, silent and sterile, with the soft hum of ventilation being the only sound that accompanied Cora's footsteps. As she pushed her cleaning cart toward the service elevator, a thought lingered in her mind, a thought that refused to be dismissed like so many others before it. Why had Reginald Blackwood, a man so clearly wrapped in his own world of wealth and power, taken an interest in her? The way he had looked at her in the suite wasn't the same cold detachment she had felt earlier. It had been different, almost like he had been calculating something, testing her in a way that she hadn't understood. Cora wasn't naive. She had been around people like Reginald before, but something about this interaction left her unsettled. As she stepped into the small confines of the service elevator, the polished chrome walls reflecting her worn-out face, Cora tried to shake off the thoughts. Her shift wasn't over, and she still had 3 more rooms to clean before she could clock out. She couldn't afford to dwell on the behavior of someone like Reginald Blackwood, no matter how strange it seemed. But as the elevator descended toward the basement level, where the service corridors would take her to the next set of rooms, Cora couldn't help but replay the interaction in her mind. His question, how long she had been doing this, echoed in her thoughts. There had been something unnerving in the way he had asked it, as if he had expected her to answer differently, as if he were probing her for something more. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Cora stepped out into the dimly lit service corridor, where the scent of cleaning supplies and industrial machinery filled the air. Her mind was still preoccupied as she wheeled her cart down the narrow hallway, her body moving on autopilot while her thoughts churned. As she reached the door of her next assigned room, Cora paused, gripping the handle of her cart more tightly than necessary. The memory of Reginald's eyes on her still clung to her like an unwelcome presence, and she felt an inexplicable weight pressing down on her chest. She was used to dealing with difficult customers, but Reginald was different. There was something more to him, something beneath the arrogance that unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite define. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. Focus, she told herself. She couldn't afford to be distracted. There was no room for mistakes. Cora entered the next room, a much smaller and less opulent suite than the one Reginald Blackwood occupied. It was neat, with only a few towels and bed linens needing attention. As she worked, her hands moving methodically through the routine tasks, she found herself growing more agitated. She had thought the feeling would pass, that the strangeness of her encounter with Reginald would fade as the day went on, but instead, it had only intensified. She finished cleaning the room in record time, her movements brisk and efficient. But as she stepped out into the hallway once more, Cora found herself hesitating. Instead of pushing her cart toward the next room, she stood still for a moment, her thoughts swirling with a strange urgency. The nagging feeling of unease had morphed into something else, something deeper, something she hadn't felt in years. A sense of rebellion. It wasn't just about Reginald's dismissive treatment. It wasn't just about the way he had looked at her as if she were nothing more than a tool to be used. It was about something bigger than that. Something that had been simmering in her heart for far too long. For years, Cora had worked menial jobs, always keeping her head down, always taking orders without complaint. She had done what was expected of her, believing it was the only way to survive. But with Franklin gone, the quiet strength she had once relied on seemed to have withered, leaving her drifting through life, aimless and hollow. Now something inside her had snapped awake. It wasn't rage, not yet, but it was a spark, a flicker of something dangerous and alive. For the first time in a long time, Cora felt the weight of all the years she had spent putting others' needs before her own, all the years of staying quiet, staying compliant. And suddenly, she didn't want to stay quiet anymore. Her thoughts returned to Reginald Blackwood. The man was powerful, no doubt. He had the kind of wealth and influence that could crush someone like her without a second thought. But that didn't mean he was untouchable. Cora knew that people like him, people who treated others like they were beneath them, often had weaknesses. And for some reason, Cora had the distinct impression that Reginald Blackwood wasn't as invincible as he pretended to be. Without fully understanding why, Cora made a decision. Instead of continuing on to her next room, she turned her cart around and headed back toward the elevator. Her hands gripped the handle of the cart tightly, her knuckles white as she wheeled it through the long corridor, her footsteps steady and determined. She wasn't sure what she was going to do when she got there, but she knew one thing for certain. She was going back to Reginald Blackwood's suite. When the elevator doors opened to the top floor once again, Cora's heart raced with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. What was she doing? She was risking everything, her job, her livelihood, by going back up there. But something inside her urged her forward, a force that felt larger than herself, pulling her toward something she couldn't fully explain. As she neared the door to the suite, Cora took a deep breath. Her mind buzzed with 1,000 possibilities, each more reckless than the last. What if he fired her on the spot? What if he made sure she could never work in this hotel again, or any hotel in the city? The fear was real, but so was the surge of defiance that had built up inside her. Before she could second-guess herself, she knocked firmly on the door. There was a long pause before the door swung open, revealing one of Reginald's assistants, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of Cora. "What is it?" the assistant asked, her tone clipped and impatient. Cora swallowed, trying to steady her voice. "I need to speak with Mr. Blackwood." The assistant frowned, clearly annoyed. "He's busy," she said curtly, moving to close the door. But Cora didn't budge. "It won't take long." The assistant raised an eyebrow, her lips pursing in disapproval, but something in Cora's expression must have given her pause. With a reluctant sigh, the assistant stepped aside, gesturing for Cora to enter. Cora walked into the suite, her heart pounding in her chest, as she caught sight of Reginald Blackwood standing by the window, his back turned to her. The view of the city stretched out before him, but Cora could tell from the way his shoulders were set that he was still frustrated, still wound up from whatever deal he had been negotiating earlier. Without turning around, Reginald spoke, his voice as smooth as ever, though tinged with annoyance. "What now? I thought I made it clear that I didn't want to be disturbed." Cora's hands clenched at her sides, her nerves alight with both fear and anger. "I'm not here to disturb you," she said, her voice firm, surprising even herself. "I'm here because I think you've gotten used to people letting you treat them like garbage, and I'm not going to be one of them." Reginald slowly turned, his expression unreadable as he looked at her. For a moment, the room was filled with a tense silence, the kind that crackled with unspoken words. Cora's heart pounded louder, but she didn't back down. She met his gaze head-on, refusing to look away, refusing to be intimidated. "What do you want, exactly?" Reginald asked, his tone no longer dismissive but curious, as though he were seeing her in a new light. Cora stood her ground. "I want you to understand that just because you're rich doesn't mean you're better than anyone else. You may have money, But that doesn't give you the right to treat people like they're invisible. Reginald stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Is that so?" he said, his voice low and contemplative. He crossed the room slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You think you know me, don't you? You think you've got me all figured out." Cora's jaw tightened. "I know enough." Reginald stopped in front of her, his gaze piercing, but something had changed in his demeanor. The arrogance was still there, but it was tempered now, laced with something else, something darker, more complex. "People like you," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper, "always think they can take the moral high ground because they've never had power. You've never been in a position where the stakes are high enough to justify doing whatever it takes to win." Cora felt a chill run down her spine at his words, but she refused to be swayed. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly, "but that doesn't mean I'm wrong." For a long moment, Reginald didn't say anything. Unraveling the game. The silence between Cora and Reginald stretched on, heavy and tense, like a rope being pulled taut, ready to snap. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if the very air was waiting for one of them to break. Cora could feel her pulse hammering in her chest, but she didn't flinch, didn't look away. Whatever strange power this man wielded, it wouldn't sway her now. She had come too far, and she couldn't back down. Reginald's lips curled into a slight smile, though it wasn't warm. It was the smile of someone amused by a challenge. He took a step closer, and Cora could feel the weight of his presence bearing down on her. He was taller than she had realized, towering over her, but she didn't move. "You think you're different, don't you?" he asked quietly. His voice had a soft, almost hypnotic quality to it now, like the low rumble of a storm in the distance. "You think you're not like the others who bend and break for a paycheck, for the scraps I throw them. But you're wrong." Cora clenched her fists at her sides, refusing to let his words shake her. "I'm not here for your approval," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here because I know what it's like to be used, to be looked at like you're just a means to an end. I've been doing this too long to let someone like you push me around." Reginald's eyes gleamed with something dangerous, but there was a flicker of interest there too. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms as if considering her more deeply. "And what makes you think you can stand up to me, Cora?" He said her name for the first time, letting it roll off his tongue slowly. "What makes you think you have any power here at all?" The way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine, but Cora didn't let it show. Instead, she took a breath and stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I don't need power," she said, her voice calm, but her eyes fierce. "I have something you'll never understand. You think money can buy everything, but it can't buy self-respect. It can't buy the ability to look yourself in the mirror every day and know you didn't sell your soul to the highest bidder." Reginald's smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of something passing through his gaze. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "You talk a good game, Cora," he said, his tone icy now. "But in the end, everyone has a price. The only difference is how much they're willing to take before they break." Cora felt her heart twist at his words, the painful truth in them hitting harder than she'd expected. She had seen it time and time again. People like her who had been pushed to the breaking point, who had given up their pride and dignity for survival. She had been one of them, at times. But this was different. This was about more than just getting by. "You're wrong," Cora said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not everyone breaks." Reginald studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as if looking for a crack in her resolve. But he found none. Instead, he found something else, something he hadn't expected. A quiet strength, a defiance that refused to be silenced. And for the first time in a long time, Reginald felt uncertain. He wasn't used to people like Cora standing up to him. He wasn't used to being challenged in this way. And it unsettled him, more than he cared to admit. The silence stretched on again, thicker now, almost suffocating. Cora could feel the weight of his gaze on her, as if he were trying to peel away the layers of her defenses. But she didn't waver. She had nothing to lose. Finally, Reginald exhaled softly, his posture relaxing just enough to show he had made some kind of decision. He turned away from her and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling city below. The afternoon light streamed in, casting long shadows across the sleek furniture, bathing the room in a golden glow. He stood there for a moment, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. The silence between them felt different now, less charged, as if some unspoken understanding had settled between them. "You're right," Reginald said quietly, his voice no longer cold but contemplative. "Money can't buy everything. It can't buy trust. It can't buy loyalty. Not the kind that matters anyway." Cora blinked, surprised by the shift in his tone. It wasn't what she had expected, and for a brief moment, she wondered if she had misjudged him. But no, she couldn't let her guard down. Not with someone like Reginald Blackwood. And yet, he continued, turning to face her again. Power, real power, comes from understanding people. Knowing what makes them tick, what drives them, what they want, what they fear. He walked toward her slowly, his movements deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. "You think you know me, Cora, but you don't. Not really." Cora's eyes narrowed, her body tense as he approached. "What do you want from me?" Reginald stopped a few feet away, his gaze intense but unreadable. "I want to make a deal." Cora's breath caught in her throat. A deal? With Reginald Blackwood? The very idea sent a surge of unease through her, but also a flicker of curiosity. What kind of deal could he possibly want to make with someone like her? "What kind of deal?" she asked warily. Reginald's lips curved into that same enigmatic smile, the one that hinted at secrets he wasn't ready to share. "You've impressed me, Cora. Not many people have the guts to stand up to me. Fewer still manage to get under my skin. But you've got something. Something I can use." Cora's pulse quickened. "Use?" Reginald held up a hand, as if to calm her suspicions. "Not in the way you're thinking. I'm offering you an opportunity. A chance to be more than just a hotel maid. To be someone who matters." Cora frowned, skepticism rising in her chest. "And what's the catch?" Reginald chuckled softly. "Smart girl. There's always a catch, isn't there?" He paused, his eyes darkening with something that looked almost like regret. "The catch is that once you step into my world, there's no going back. You'll see things, do things, that will change you. But you'll also have power. Real power. And with that, you can make a difference. You can control your own fate." Cora's mind raced. This was insane. She had come here to confront him, to call him out for his arrogance, and now he was offering her a deal. A chance to change her life. It didn't make sense, and yet there was a part of her, a small, stubborn part, that was intrigued. That was tired of being invisible, tired of scraping by. But at what cost? "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice low. Reginald's expression didn't change. "Then you go back to cleaning rooms, pretending that this never happened. But know this, Cora, people like you don't get offers like this every day. You're special. You just don't realize it yet." Cora swallowed hard, her thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and fear. But beneath it all, there was something else. Hope. A dangerous, intoxicating hope that maybe, just maybe, she could finally take control of her life. That she could be more than what she had been forced to become. She looked up at Reginald, her heart pounding in her chest, and made her decision. "I'll listen," she said quietly, "but I'm not making any promises." Reginald's smile widened, and for the first time, it looked genuine. "That's all I ask." As he stepped closer, extending his hand to her, Cora hesitated for only a moment before taking it. The deal wasn't sealed yet, but the wheels had been set in motion. And as their hands clasped, Cora couldn't help but wonder if she had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid. She felt alive. The devil's bargain. Cora felt the warmth of Reginald's hand around hers, firm but not overpowering, as if he were testing her. She stood still, her heart still pounding, unsure of what she had just set in motion. Everything in her life up to this point had been dictated by survival. Day to day, paycheck to paycheck, always under the weight of someone else's expectations. But now, in this one moment, she was holding the reins of something bigger, though she wasn't sure whether she was steering it or if it was about to steer her. Reginald let go of her hand and turned, motioning for her to follow him. The tension in the room shifted, but it didn't dissipate. There was an understanding now, an agreement, however temporary or uncertain. As he walked, his footsteps echoed through the vast room, bouncing off the marble floors, each step measured, calculated. They passed the large glass windows that overlooked the city, and Cora caught her reflection. Just a shadowy figure behind the gleam of the midday sun. She had come here with a singular purpose, and now she was following him down a path she hadn't anticipated. But she couldn't back down, not after all the years of swallowing her pride and keeping her head down. Reginald led her to a side door in the room that opened into what looked like a private study. It was smaller, more intimate than the rest of the suite, with deep wood paneling and walls lined with books. Actual, physical books. The air smelled of leather and aged paper, a stark contrast to the sterile, modern world outside. A fire crackled softly in the fireplace, casting a warm glow that danced across the polished mahogany. He gestured for her to sit in one of the leather armchairs by the fire, and after a moment's hesitation, she did. Reginald moved with a fluid grace, almost predatory, as he settled into the chair opposite her. For a moment, the crackling fire was the only sound between them. Cora studied him. In the dim light, his face seemed less sharp, less domineering, and yet there was something in his eyes, a hunger, perhaps, or a deep, unquenchable ambition. She couldn't decide if it was alluring or terrifying. Maybe it was both. Reginald broke the silence, his voice soft but cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've been living in the shadows for too long, Cora. Scraping by, doing what you have to. But I see more in you. You have potential, a spark that most people in your position never realize they have." Cora kept her gaze steady, refusing to let him intimidate her. "Is this where you tell me you're going to change my life?" Reginald's lips twitched into a faint smile. "No, this is where I tell you that you're going to change your life. I'm just offering you the tools. A way out of the shadows." Cora leaned back slightly in the chair, folding her arms across her chest. "And what exactly are these tools you're offering?" Reginald's expression didn't change, but there was a gleam in his eyes that made Cora's skin prickle. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepling in front of him. "Information, connections, influence, power, if you're willing to take it. But power doesn't come without cost." Cora felt a shiver run down her spine. "And what's the cost?" Reginald's gaze locked onto hers, unblinking, unwavering. "Loyalty. To me." Cora's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had expected this. Of course, he wouldn't just hand her the keys to her freedom without asking for something in return. And yet there was a part of her, a small, dangerous part, that wondered if this was what she had been waiting for all along. A way out, a way to finally stop being a victim of circumstance. "What exactly do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside her. Reginald's smile widened, though it still didn't reach his eyes. "I want someone who can see the world for what it really is, someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty. You've lived at the bottom long enough to know how things work. You understand people, their desires, their weaknesses. That's valuable." Cora's brow furrowed. "And what would I be doing?" "Exactly." Reginald leaned back, studying her with that same calculating gaze. "At first, nothing you're not already doing. But you'll have more access, more responsibility. You'll be my eyes and ears in places I can't be. Eventually, you'll manage things, people, situations, all in exchange for compensation, of course. Cora's throat tightened. Compensation. The word felt heavy, weighted with implications. She had no illusions about what Reginald was offering. This wasn't some fairy tale where she would be lifted out of her struggles and into a life of comfort. This was a deal with the devil, plain and simple. And the devil always collected his due. "I don't know anything about managing people," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. She had been managing people, her siblings, her coworkers, even the guests at the hotel. For years. It just hadn't come with a title or a paycheck. Reginald waved a hand dismissively. "You'll learn. Besides, I'm not looking for someone with a degree in management. I'm looking for someone with instincts. Someone who can see the bigger picture, but isn't afraid to handle the smaller, messier details." Cora's mind raced. She had spent so much of her life in survival mode, just trying to keep her head above water, that the idea of stepping into a world where she had real influence, where she wasn't just reacting to circumstances, but shaping them, was intoxicating. And yet, the price of that power, the strings attached, loomed large in her mind. "What happens if I say no?" she asked, her voice quiet. Reginald's smile faded, and for the first time, his expression hardened. "Then you walk out of here, and nothing changes. You go back to your life, and I go back to mine. But make no mistake, Cora, this opportunity won't come again. If you turn it down, you'll be choosing the life you have now. Forever." Cora swallowed hard. The life she had now. The one where every day felt like a battle just to survive. The one where she was invisible, expendable, and always struggling to make ends meet. Was that really what she wanted? To go back to being just another cog in a machine that didn't care whether she lived or died? And yet, the alternative was equally terrifying. To step into Reginald's world meant giving up any illusion of safety or normalcy. It meant becoming part of something darker, something she couldn't fully understand yet. But maybe that was what she needed. Maybe she was tired of playing it safe, tired of being afraid. Cora took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like 1,000 pounds. She looked Reginald in the eye, searching for any hint of deception or malice. But all she saw was a man who understood the world in a way few people did. A man who knew how to get what he wanted, and was offering her a chance to do the same. "I'm not making any promises," she said finally, her voice steady. "But I'll consider it." Reginald's smile returned, and this time it was almost warm. Almost. "That's all I ask." He stood, signaling the end of the conversation, and Cora rose to her feet as well. As she followed him back toward the main room, her mind was still racing, but she couldn't deny the spark of excitement that had ignited in her chest. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a choice. Reginald paused at the door, turning to face her one last time. "Take your time. Think it over. But remember, Cora, some opportunities only come once." With that, he opened the door, and Cora stepped out into the hallway, her heart pounding in her ears. As the door closed behind her, she felt the weight of the decision she had yet to make settle over her like a heavy cloak. Whatever happened next, her life would never be the same. Walking the edge of the blade, Cora walked out of Reginald's suite, the echo of the closing door reverberating through the long, silent corridor. The plush carpeting beneath her feet seemed to swallow the sound of her footsteps as she moved mechanically toward the elevator, her mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. The hotel's luxury had faded into the background, drowned out by the tension building in her chest. She had come here looking for something simple, an opportunity, a crack in the wall of her life that she could slit through and find something better on the other side. But what she'd found was a doorway that led into darkness. Reginald had made his offer, and it wasn't just a ticket out of her current misery. It was a doorway into an entirely new world, one that pulsed with danger and power. But it was dangerous. There was no denying that. What kind of man could casually talk about loyalty and power like they were nothing more than the price of admission? And what kind of life awaited her as she accepted? A life of deception, manipulation, possibly worse. But then again, wasn't her life already filled with those things, only on a smaller, more suffocating scale? The lies she told to herself, her family, her employer, just to get through the day. As the elevator doors slid open, Cora stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby, her hand trembling slightly. The polished steel walls reflected her image back at her, a woman who looked like she was holding it together, but just barely. Her eyes, though, told a different story. They were wide, uncertain, as if she were teetering on the edge of something she couldn't fully comprehend. The doors closed, sealing her in the small space, and Cora leaned against the wall, letting out a shaky breath. She had always prided herself on being a survivor. Life had thrown its fair share of hardships at her, and she'd always found a way to claw her way back up. But this was different. Reginald wasn't offering her a way out of hardship. He was offering her control over it, control over others, control over herself. It was the kind of power that could reshape her entire existence. But at what cost? The elevator dinged softly as it arrived at the lobby, and Cora pushed herself off the wall, her mind still racing. She stepped out into the bustling hotel foyer, where the noise and movement of people flowed around her like a river. Businessmen in tailored suits, tourists with luggage, hotel staff flitting back and forth with the quiet efficiency of well-oiled machines. It all felt so far removed from the decision that weighed on her. She needed to clear her head, to get away from the pressure that seemed to be closing in on her from all sides. Cora pushed through the revolving doors of the hotel and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the city, but she barely noticed. Her feet carried her down the street, away from the luxury of the hotel, away from Reginald's shadow, but the weight of his offer clung to her like a second skin. As she walked, the city's energy buzzed around her. The constant hum of cars, the chatter of people on the sidewalk, the distant wail of a siren. But Cora was lost in her own thoughts. Could she really trust Reginald? He had all the trappings of a man used to getting what he wanted, a man who didn't hesitate to pull strings behind the scenes to make things happen. She had seen men like him before, though never up close, never in a position where she was being offered a place at their side. It was tempting, she had to admit. The idea of finally having some say in her own life, of being the one pulling the strings instead of dancing at the end of them. It stirred something in her, a part of her that had grown tired of fighting for scraps, tired of always being on the losing end of someone else's decisions. But the risks, Reginald hadn't spelled them out, but she knew they were there, lurking beneath the surface of his offer like sharks beneath still waters. The kind of power he was talking about didn't come without enemies, and once you stepped into that world, there was no going back. She'd be trading one set of problems for another, but at least these new problems came with a kind of agency she had never experienced before. Cora stopped at a crosswalk, her gaze distant as she stared at the blinking red light. The city's skyline loomed in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the darkening sky. Was she really considering this? Was she really thinking about stepping into Reginald's world? She closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise, trying to still the storm of thoughts in her head. She had spent so long trying to keep her head above water, fighting for every inch, every dollar, every opportunity. Maybe it was time to stop fighting for survival and start fighting for something more. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid of what might happen if she reached too far, if she took too big a risk. But how could she trust him? How could she trust that Reginald wouldn't just use her and discard her when she was no longer useful? He was a man who clearly thrived on control, and once she stepped into his orbit, there was no telling what he might demand from her. The light changed, and Cora moved across the street, her steps slower now, more deliberate. The city's energy seemed to pulse around her, pushing her forward even as she hesitated. She needed to talk to someone, to get another perspective. But who could she talk to? No one in her life would understand. Her family wouldn't even believe the position she was in. And her friends, well, most of them were barely hanging on themselves. No one in her world had ever been offered what she had been offered. The thought struck her like a lightning bolt. She was alone in this, completely and utterly alone. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that was why Reginald had chosen her. He knew she had nothing and no one, no safety net to catch her if she fell. That's what made her valuable. And that's what made her dangerous. Cora found herself standing in front of a small park, its grass lush and green despite the encroaching twilight. She wandered in, finding an empty bench near a fountain, the water's soft trickle offering a momentary respite from the noise of the city. She sat down, leaning forward, her elbows resting on her knees as she stared at the ground. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, heavier now than it had been in Reginald's office. Out here, in the world, it seemed more real, more immediate. She had been drifting for so long, just going through the motions, waiting for something, anything, to change. And now, change had arrived, wrapped in a package she wasn't sure she wanted to open. Cora rubbed her hands together, the cool evening air starting to bite at her skin. She had always prided herself on being strong, on surviving whatever life threw at her. But surviving wasn't the same as living. Reginald had made her see that, and that realization scared her more than anything. She had grown so used to scraping by, to being invisible, that the idea of stepping into a life where she had real power, real control, was both intoxicating and terrifying. She could walk away. She could go back to her life, to the safety of the shadows. But the shadows were suffocating her, weren't they? Slowly, day by day, they were squeezing the life out of her, and she hadn't even realized it until now. Cora exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry away some of the tension in her chest. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know if she could trust Reginald, or if she was walking into a trap. But she knew one thing. She couldn't go back to the way things were. Not after this. Not after tasting the possibility of something more. She had spent too long playing it safe. Maybe it was time to take a risk. The thought settled in her mind, solid and immovable, like a stone dropped into a calm pond. The ripples spread outward, pushing aside the doubts, the fears, leaving only the cold, hard truth. She had to decide. And whatever she chose, there would be no turning back.